Welcome to the FindBiometrics and Mobile ID World podcast. I'm your host, Peter Counter, and I'm the managing editor of both FindBiometrics and Mobile ID World. Readers of FindBiometrics will know that May is On-Device Biometrics Month, a 5-week deep dive on the authentication paradigm that's killing passwords. And that's why, in this episode, I'm sitting down with David Benini, Vice President of Marketing and Product at Aware. Our conversation starts with how biometrics are killing the password, the FIDO Alliance, and the role that standards play in the proliferation of biometrics. We pivot to a broader discussion on biometrics in the workplace. Aware recently published a new white paper, Enterprise Security in the Age of Remote and Mobile Work, and we talk about how both on-device biometrics and server-side biometrics enable efficient and safe work. Our discussion touches on liveness detection too, and looks ahead to what lies in store for the biometrics industry, ending with some fun future gazing. So without further ado, I present my conversation with David Benini, Vice President of Marketing and Product at Aware, right here on the FindBiometrics and Mobile ID World podcast. Joined today by David Benini, Vice President, Marketing and Product for Aware. Thanks for joining me today, David.
Good afternoon, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here.
So it's On-Device Biometrics Month at FindBiometrics. And when we talk about on-device biometrics, inevitably, we talk about biometrics as a password replacement. And so with biometrics increasingly used in place of passwords for mobile authentication, what's behind this adoption push?
We first saw it from Apple. I'll call it the Apple effect. I think in the industry, we had been thinking about it and talking about it quite a bit. But let's face it, it took validation from a company like Apple to say, hey, yeah, this really works. And once they did that, I think people trusted it more because they trust Apple, and they realized how convenient it is, and particularly on mobile. So it's one thing on a PC at your office or at home, to deal with passwords. It tends to be a little bit easier. At least I've got like a cheat sheet for my passwords. But on a mobile phone, you never know where you're going to be. And passwords is just not practical. So that was the first part of the push. I also think the products are just maturing so much. Over time, you've seen lots of different vendors get into the space, offering a wide variety of solutions that work well, whether they be facial recognition or keystroke or voice or what have you. And part of that maturity process, I think, is this improvement of the algorithm performance. We heard from NIST somewhat recently about the leaps and bounds with which the algorithms are improving from a performance standpoint. And that just means basically that the algorithms are able to avoid causing false matches and false non-matches. So a false match being when that's the bad one. That's when we match to the wrong person, potentially a bad guy, but also the false non-matches where a person is trying to log in using biometrics and and you're not able to match to that reference data, which then kind of ties into convenience and user experience. And I think that's another really important aspect of this, and another area where the algorithms are really improving. When you improve your algorithms, you're also just improving the user experience because you're reducing the frequency of failures to capture. And that basically means I can use my biometrics in a poorly lit place or a noisy place. It happens quickly. It happens even if I'm holding my phone in a different kind of position than normal. So all of those things are being addressed in various ways, such as machine learning and AI. So I think all of these things are coming together, and really, we're seeing this industry mature in real time. And I think we're going to look back at this period and say, wow, that was when biometrics for authentication became a real thing.
Yeah, it's really interesting you're talking about the user experience and how I think that really does tie in with what you call the Apple effect. Just the idea of people getting to use biometrics and in their everyday lives. We have the FindBiometrics year in review every year, and every single time the top interaction point of everybody who takes the survey when it comes to biometrics is unlocking their phones. And I think that has a lot to do with it. Are there other markets specifically that you see really helping with that push?
Yeah, well, sure. I mean, unlocking your phone, we only do that about, 80 to 100 times a day. So yeah, you can see why people, that would be important for people. There's a couple different ways I segment this market in my head. One is where we're looking at consumer facing applications, and this is the type of thing that you're referring to, I think, where people are just getting onto their phone. And then I also think about employee facing solutions where we're really trying to improve security for employees, and they're kind of different use cases. And then there's kind of the concepts of device native functionality. So you'll see like an Apple Face ID or Touch ID incorporated into the phone or whatever the Samsung equivalents are. I'm kind of an Apple guy, but the other application is when we incorporate the software into an application, an actual mobile app. And that's where companies like mine are focused. And we're really addressing a market where delegating the user experience and the security level to the device manufacturer doesn't really work for them. So the reason why you might incorporate this functionality into the app is because, well, first of all, you don't want the performance to be dictated by a device manufacturer. So your application might, it's not a one size fits all in this particular case. You're trying to do something, say you're a commercial bank and you're trying to put a higher level of security on very large transactions. Well, you probably wouldn't want to trust the same security levels that people are using to just access their phone. It also, when you do that, you're not having different devices provide different user experience. So you're really kind of taking ownership of that user experience, and you can customize that and own it and brand it. So if you're a bank or an insurance company, these are companies that are all about security. What is a bank? Fundamentally, they're a place where you securely store money. That's one of the things they do for us.
Mhm.
Security is completely fundamental to their brand. And so you might want to take ownership of that element of the branding and the user experience in your app and differentiate it from competitors.
hmm Yeah, and that sort of wide angle idea, all of these different ways that we can authenticate, it reminds me of, going back to the death of the password, there are the new FIDO2 standards that have been built in to all of the major browsers. And as a password replacement, again, we're going to be able to see people authenticating with these different biometric solutions. Do you see consumer use of passwords actually falling away in the next 5 years with this motion?
Well, I think we all certainly hope so. And I think FIDO is giving that a really big push. It's hard to underestimate the impact that they've had. It's like the adoption is still in progress, but standards have always been a really big part of the biometrics world, and it's because it's important to the functionality of biometrics because you kind of have things happening in different places. There's a client component and a server component, and whenever you have that, you need standards to enable the marketplace. And so Fido's done a really good job not only defining an architecture and the interfaces to these subcomponents, but what that does is basically create a marketplace for these authenticators. So now instead of having just big companies with access to the device manufacturers or just the device manufacturers themselves kind of controlling the technology, you create this marketplace where lots of companies can participate. And the other thing that Fido's done a really cool job at is creating these performance specs and standards and even a certification program. So really kind of taking the whole problem from soup to nuts, so where yes, you can publish a document and pray that people follow it, but by adding the certification and the performance levels really has a big impact. The reason is biometrics tend to be really hard to evaluate. You need data. It's kind of a manual, messy process. It can be very subjective. I don't know if the analogy is perfect, but there's like the first three letters of biometrics are bio, so
hmm
there's this element of this statistical element of biometrics, not completely unlike the healthcare field where things happen and you just don't always know why. And the performance of an algorithm depends entirely on the data that you're using to test it. So
hmm
people in the industry understand that, but on the outside, people don't always fully understand that, and consumers of the technology really need to get a handle on this, because you really have to know how the algorithms are performing and behaving in your use case to ensure their proper use. And so what FIDO has done, to bring it back to FIDO, is they have utilized standards that have been worked on by experts in the field at ISO and NIST, and said, okay, yeah, well, we're going to set up a certification program that allows vendors to come in and have their products evaluated. And they did something that hasn't really been done before, which is set performance levels. So
Hmm.
they're not just saying this is how a lab is going to test the algorithms, but your algorithm has to meet these performance thresholds. They've even done that for liveness detection or presentation attack detection, which is arguably even harder to achieve than matching and harder to evaluate than matching.
Aware recently published a white paper titled Enterprise Security in the Age of Remote and Mobile Work. And I'd like to talk about that for a bit. First, how has work changed thanks to mobility and connectivity?
Well, I mean, I think one thing that mobility and connectivity does for an enterprise is give you global access to talent that isn't dictated by your geography. So if I have a great idea and I start a company, but I happen to be in a remote location, or my company is just based somewhere where I'm struggling to find talent, I'm struggling to compete for talent. Mobility allows me to utilize professionals regardless of where they're located, or what their work schedules might be. So I think that's a big part of it. It's really, as companies continue to get more and more optimized and finely tuned, and I think to be competitive, it's this kind of thing that really can make a difference. So now we're accommodating different types of work, as our paper starts out with, and what that means. The problem with it and the challenge is that it opens up security holes. It's a lot more challenging to try to secure your assets when they're being accessed from within a building behind a locked door. But if you need to allow your staff to access these assets from home or from Starbucks or whatever, you need to make some changes. And that's kind of where we're thinking about it. We're really thinking about folks that are working outside the office. I mean, we've got virtual companies now that don't even have a central facility. The cloud is contributing to that. So what we're saying is, well, yes, biometric authentication is great for consumers and people conducting finance on their phone, but we can also use it to help them get access to corporate assets more securely and certainly more conveniently. And the way we do that is it's basically it's using your phone as a token and doing a mobile push, that when you enter your username into a website, we push a message to your phone and prompt you to do some biometric authentication. And that could be multi-factor, it could be several factor over and above biometric. But we're using face and voice to authenticate the person and allow them to log in to these assets without using a password.
Right. There are a lot of benefits there. I mean, obviously, just being able to add security to this like larger network, essentially, of business without a centralized office. But I'm thinking, how specifically are biometrics improving efficiency and security in the workplace that you've described?
Well, it really gets back to the flaws of passwords. So, if we think about passwords and where they came from, I mean, these were conceived in the early 1960s, and those types of networks and computing platforms, which, and we've kind of, passwords have kind of, they've kind of followed us all the way to, 50 plus years later. We're still using them in a much clumsier form, because now our password isn't something that's 6 or 7. I'm guessing in the 60s, passwords were probably like a single word of lowercase letters of 6 or 7 letters, right? And today
Right.
we're required to use all sorts of different characters and numbers and capital letters. I mean, the passwords are basically killing themselves. I mean, they've become so difficult to use. I have a negative experience with passwords almost every single day, where I can't, I just don't remember what password. I try to be secure and I try to use different ones. I think we're all having the same experience. So by relying less on password, and we don't have to eliminate them necessarily, but I think by first of all making it harder for somebody to use a phished password or a stolen password by adding these other factors, namely a phone as a factor, a biometric as a factor, a second biometric as a factor. We're also moving away from this requirement to store security data like passwords centrally where it can be breached. And so that was a big goal of on-device biometrics, and FIDO in particular, was to eliminate any kind of large security data residing on a server that could potentially be valuable. So as you know, like FIDO works essentially by conducting the biometric matching or the authentication on the device, and really the only information needed on the server is a public key, which doesn't have any value to a hacker. So I think that's really what FIDO is all about, and I think what ultimately we're going to see, the reason why we're going to see passwords go away, because finally, thanks again in part to efforts at FIDO to really start coming up with other different types of solutions that really work and work better. They're more secure.
On-Device Biometrics Month is made possible by a sponsorship from Aware. Learn more about biometric authentication and identity proofing and how they're enabling remote and mobile workplaces by visiting aware.com/resources and downloading Aware's new white paper, Enterprise Security in the Age of Remote and Mobile Work. And now, back to the podcast.
Biometrics are stronger inherently than passwords, but recently, actually, I would say probably ever since Touch ID, this has always been part of the conversation, is presentation attacks against consumer devices specifically and consumer authentication. But this is a sort of a problem across the board with biometrics, and that sort of renewed this conversation about the importance of liveness detection and presentation attack detection. And so, for the listeners, what is liveness detection and why is it so important?
Presentation attack detection, liveness detection, spoof detection is really all about preventing a fraudster from using a reproduction of a biometric sample as if it was a live sample. So biometrics rely on the use of live samples, meaning from some aspect of your person in real time. So to the extent that a particular biometric modality is vulnerable to somebody using a reproduction, they are vulnerable to attacks. So it's kind of funny how liveness detection has evolved, because when the discussions about it and the standards bodies originally started, it was really all about fingerprint. That was the primary modality that NIST was concerned about anyway, and that's why they were pushing it into ISO. They were worried about people in the passport lanes walking up to the desk with a rubber finger, and evading those really important searches that get conducted there. But but back then, facial recognition was kind of the dog of the three modalities in the race. There was fingerprint, face, and iris. But what has happened, as I mentioned earlier, that facial recognition has become so much better thanks to machine learning. It's really emerged as the leading modality for biometrics, and certainly for biometric authentication. The problem with that is that it also happens to be the most vulnerable to spoofing, because you can pass a match quite easily with a photograph or a video. The algorithms are trying to do that. They're trying to find a match. So they're going to match to a face printed on a piece of paper or in a video stream off of a television or a phone. So that is completely unacceptable, and facial biometrics as an authentication mechanism are basically a non-starter if you don't have really robust liveness detection. And not only that, you're defenses are about, just like any other security mechanism, your defenses are about as strong as your weakest link in the chain. So with your liveness detection, with your attack detection, you really need to be able to detect every possible attack that you can imagine. And those include things like faces, at least in the facial domain, images printed on paper, images on a screen of a TV or a phone, three-dimensional masks, Hollywood grade masks. Like, these are the things that customers throw at us. And you need to be able to detect all of those and differentiate between those and a live image. So that's really what it's all about.
Yeah, and how specifically does Aware approach liveness?
So I put the approaches in two camps. One is an active approach where you're relying on some interaction, like some sort of challenge response with the user, such as a blink. There's also a more passive approach that you're basically analyzing the image and looking for artifacts of that image that indicate that it is a spoof. And I guess there is like a hybrid class in the middle where the user certainly knows that something's going on, but it might not be necessarily requiring them to do anything. So, and in those cases, a fraudster could be gaining some information potentially about how the technique is working. So that's one issue with those. So we do a little bit of everything, to be honest, because there are some approaches that are just better for detecting certain kinds of spoofs, but we're primarily focused on passive approaches that use machine learning developed algorithms that are able to be trained to detect a photo on a piece of paper or a screen or a mask.
Right. That's
that's really where we're, and it's a better user experience for kind of the reasons I said. One is you're not giving information to the fraudster about how to defeat it, and it's also not requiring a user to do anything that he may or may not be able to do.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the user experience at that, because obviously any sort of active addition to the authentication experience does add friction to it. And part of the reason I think that facial recognition has sort of become, the most prominent modality is because it's so frictionless. Like, if you use a face unlock on your phone, you don't even notice that it's there until it's not working. On that note, I'm wondering, what's the consumer end user experience for your Nomi solution?
So we are using face and voice biometric modalities. Face is the primary and voice is a secondary option. And clearly face can be a relatively seamless and frictionless experience. But to my point earlier about allowing banks and stakeholders to kind of customize their user experience and the security levels, we have customers that want to add voice just because they want a higher level of security and performance. And so what we do there is basically capture the facial image and the voice at the same time. So while we're prompting the user to say a passphrase with his voice, we are also collecting his facial image, and it really doesn't take any more time than just collecting a face or a voice, and we're getting two modalities out of it. So it's a little bit more invasive in the sense that you're asking somebody to say something, and not everybody wants that, but what you do get in return is about a 10x improvement in the biometric performance in terms of reducing the false match and non-match rates. And you also get a substantial improvement in liveness detection in a couple dimensions. One is, so we're using facial liveness detection as well as voice liveness detection. So on the voice side, you also want to be able to detect recordings or synthetic voice, which you're hearing more and more about, and the ability of software to generate synthetic voices based on machine learning based algorithms. But we're applying ways to detect those two things. And generally speaking, it just makes it kind of, again, like an order of magnitude more challenging for a fraudster to spoof a system where he has to now worry about not only a facial image to try to impersonate a victim, he also now needs some voice data, and he needs that voice data in the form of a passphrase. So it just makes the job of a fraudster that much more complicated. And again, getting to this point of trying to change the economics of the fraud and just make that return for that fraudster much less, and hopefully persuade him to move on to other other
Other
nefarious
endeavors.
activities.
Yeah, find a new job maybe.
Yeah,
But that is, I mean, it's a really good point. Talking about, especially, if you couple that with the FIDO centric, device centric side of things, it's like all of the work that you have to do to bypass two modalities with liveness detection that are matched on a specific device. The return on investment on the fraudster's side is just, it's not there unless there's something extremely valuable to
yes,
be authenticated with. So it does make a
exactly,
lot of sense. Yeah.
exactly.
We've been talking a lot about the authentication process, but the white paper describes uses for biometrics beyond authentication. You specifically talk about onboarding of customers and employees, and I'm wondering, how do biometrics fit into that equation?
Yeah, so right. So biometric applications fall in these kind of two categories. One is this one-to-many search where I'm trying to find a person in a database. And this other one that we've been talking about is authentication, where it's a one-to-one match, and we're basically confirming that this person is in fact the person that we have on record. So when we're talking about the former, where I'm doing a search, in the process of identity proofing and onboarding, which is really about just confirming that we know who this person is by corroborating different sources of data, a biometric search can be really useful. So we're hearing a lot more now about different ways to do identity proofing using data that's out there, private data, so names and addresses and birth dates and relationships and this kind of stuff. I mean, that data it works, but it's private data, and it's not always that terribly reliable or consistent, and that's what's kind of nice about biometrics. So in these cases, we can use biometrics to identify whether a person is trying to misidentify themselves, misrepresent themselves. So for example, that person might be in a database already in a watch list that says they've defrauded the bank before, or this
Mhm.
is an employee that we had and he got fired 4 years ago for doing whatever. So the idea with a biometric search is to assess whether or not we have encountered this person before. Another way it can be useful is to just prevent duplicate records. So, hey, this person's in my database already. He's not a bad guy, but let's not make two records for him. Let's make sure that we keep our identity records clean. But it's also a mechanism of fraud. So a fraudster might be trying to create synthetic IDs. He might have 100 different identities that he's trying to use in a fraud scheme. Well, this approach would address that. Another angle of it is identity proofing by having a person present their trusted credential, like a driver's license, and then to validate that driver's license is in fact owned by that individual, we do facial recognition between the live individual and their driver's license to just say, okay, yeah, this is not a license that you're borrowing from somebody else, or a passport that you borrowed to get into the country.
This identity proofing via biometrics really seems to lend itself to the service model, sort of the software as a service model. Is that the direction that you see it remaining in?
The way I see software as a service is really making biometrics available, particularly for that type of application like a one-to-many search, making it available to smaller and smaller organizations. Traditionally, I mean, who had biometrics? It was like the FBI and state police. That's what's changing. So we're able to kind of now take this kind of functionality and capability, identity proofing or whatever it might be, and make it available to smaller and smaller organizations. Biometrics as a service is really benefiting from all the other goodness that other applications of software as a service come from. So it's like getting to a subscription model, and as opposed to like a capex. It's like OPEX, operational expenses in place of capital expenses. So less risk, quick startup time, and it's just I absolutely think biometrics are gonna go that way for all the good reasons that other, that the whole world's basically going to the cloud. You think back, what was biometrics originally? It was a service from the FBI to state and local police. I mean, it's always kind of been a service, and it's kind of going back that way to we're coming full circle.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And look, what kind of customers do you think, like you said, it's being made available to smaller and smaller organizations, but who specifically do you think this model is right for?
Well, so we're seeing, so a great example is a customer of ours in Africa that was actually using it for patient identification in the healthcare space.
Hmm.
So this is, this is a type of organization that is not going to really want to have to stand up their own custom biometric system, and their requirement is not that terribly different than other company. They don't really need a highly customized system. So, in that kind of case, that's an example of a company that, they may own. They're still pretty substantially, pretty big system. They could conceivably be testing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of, providing services to tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people. But by doing it as a service, they just, they don't have to stand up their own system. They don't have to know about they don't have to define what it needs to do. It's just much less risk. And again, getting to this kind of subscription OpEx model is just much more attractive for a smaller organization.
Right. And how does that compare to the biometric API experience?
So yeah, we have kind of two flavors. So we brand our biometrics as a service with the name Indigo, and it kind of comes in two flavors. One is that it has these offerings with turnkey solutions that are targeted for a particular use case. But then we offer Indigo API, which are essentially microservices. So in that case, we still are running biometric functions on a server, but now the user is going to incorporate those into their own system, these these REST-based web services into their own solution. So it's really kind of both are getting some. So the first Indigo is like the benefits of like turnkey SaaS, and then the second is really the benefit of an open REST service kind of environment.
Just sort of wrapping up, I want to spend some more time sort of talking about what you were saying about how everything's going full circle in this industry. What's next for the biometrics industry?
It's remarkable what's happened over, my career in this space. I just see it really just becoming more mature and the technology working in a more seamless and frictionless way. I think for a long time we've talked about this idea of having biometrics that work in ways that are barely even perceptible to us, and I think that's a good thing, at least certainly for authentication. I think that's less attractive in a privacy concern, but for authentication, I think you want it to be largely invisible. There are some benefits of being able to be aware that the biometrics are happening. There's some satisfaction when you're successful with your biometric authentication, and that's a good thing. But generally speaking, the performance and the security just keeps getting better, and it is still accelerating. The pace of improvement, I believe, is accelerating. The machine learning is just pouring gasoline on it. The liveness detection is going to continue to get better. So I think it's just going to become more of the better it gets, the more invisible it's going to be, and we're going to just see it everywhere. It's just going to become part of our everyday.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that definitely checks out with what we're seeing at FindBiometrics. We talk a lot about the satisfaction of having a little bit of friction, but personally, I kind of wonder if that's going to fall away once we start getting used to the idea that it is safe. I feel like maybe it's just a confidence thing.
Yeah,
But
no, I agree. I think I see it happening. I think a lot of times we expect things to happen quickly, especially when you're in the industry. You see how well the technology works, but these things take time, and there's so many cases of that being the case.
yeah, drilling down to the more specific What's next for Aware?
Well, we've been in this space for a long time. We tend to take a long-term view. We've got a very broad product set, and I think I just see us continuing to make progress on a few fronts that are important for us. One is certainly the mobile authentication. We got some really, really cool things going on there. Biometrics as a service, we're in a really good position to take advantage of that trend, in part because of our expertise in browser-based biometrics. So we have a really, really solid solution for that. It's deployed throughout the DoD in what is probably the largest browser-based enrollment project in the world. It's the largest employer in the world. And finally, our ABIS. So we've had all these components for such a long time, and we've put these different components together and provided an ABIS that includes the most modern forensic workstation products on the market, really high performance algorithms, scalable, just really putting the most modern technologies behind it. So we're excited about that. So we've got our plates full, broad product set. We're trying to do a lot of things. We're still a small company based here in Boston. Everything gets done here, but no, we're doing it. It's happening.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today, Dave. For anybody who's listening and wants to get in contact with you or the people at Aware, where can they find you? How can they do that?
I would just come to aware.com and send us a note.
All right. Excellent. Well, thanks again for taking the time to talk to me, and talk to you soon.
This was great. Thanks so much, Peter. Bye, everybody.
No problem.
And that's all for our conversation with David Benini. To learn more about Aware or to get in contact with questions from our conversation, visit aware.com. To learn more about On-Device Biometrics, head over to FindBiometrics.com and read our special featured articles for the month of May. On-Device Biometrics Month is sponsored again by Aware. Special thanks to Lagomrad for the use of our podcast music. I have been your host, Peter Counter, and until next time, own your identity.